All right, thanks everybody for joining me today. We're kicking this off. Eric Tienda, we're going to be talking about a payer's journey to regulatory compliance and beyond for the ONC final rule, so patient and provider API. A little bit of information about me. I've been in healthcare and IT for about 10 years. I'm an enterprise architect, business architect practitioner, fully believe in using business capabilities and planning as part of your architecture practice, embedding them in any way possible to understand change for your business. I'm an interoperability zealot. I love the opportunities that are in front of us right now with everything HL7 FHIR, all the use cases that are available today from a payer perspective, from a provider perspective, and the healthcare ecosystem. And I'm a serial hobbyist. If you have that problem as well, we can talk about how to convince loved ones to let us buy and drop expensive hobbies at will. I'm representing CareSource today. A little bit about CareSource. We are a Medicare Medicaid managed health plan. We're in about 6 states currently, and we have about 2.3 million members, mostly Medicare, Medicaid, exchange products, MLTSS, and D-SNP. So the agenda today basically is to talk about why interoperability, some of the drivers that forced us to be here today, some of the journey for scoping and understanding what we had to do, and then obviously delivery, challenges along the way, and what we intend to do in the future for interoperability. So why interoperability? The 21st Century Cures Act came out, and architecture started looking to some of the changes for CareSource when it dropped. This was the CMS plan to basically take everything from ADT information all the way to the patient-provider API and transition of care and payer-to-payer data exchange. So we were trying to understand what that meant from a roadmap perspective for some of our enterprise systems. That's claims payment, CM, understanding what types of change they were going to have to go under and how we could align those roadmaps for to address what we knew we were going to have to invest in. This ended up basically being an analysis that took 45 real-world use case examples, everything from CM to quality, and even the contact center for some of the external-facing interfaces, as well as internal use by employees for interoperability data. This is basically building that library of what we intended to offer to the business, saying, please make this investment outside of the regulatory requirements, and we can enable some of these things for you. So when the ONC final rule dropped for 9115, we were actually getting ready to do our 2021 business planning. So the architecture team had already taken and collated all of the information from our business constituents for what the investments were, or the portfolio of investments were for the 2021 period. We use a capability-based assessment planning and started talking about cross-dependencies between projects and investments. So for 2020, 2021, it just so happened that we were investing a lot in integration. We were deprecating our middleware or service bus for EMS from TIBCO to Boomi. We were bringing up an API gateway. We were swapping out some of our IAM tools for single sign-on, identity and access management. Obviously, these are a lot of things that intersected directly with interoperability. So we had to start planning for not only the technical support aspects of what we were bringing up, but also some of the business investments that wanted to focus on things like redoing our provider portal at the time or enhancing provider information management, provider data, basically, to make sure that everybody knew that we had to do the 9115 interoperability, that we needed to plan and talk in reality about what project comes first, second, or third, and how we can plan for some of those dependencies that basically we were creating. So the start of the journey, after we had the ruling for 9115 and architecture defining what some of the impact was from the Cures Act, basically we got together our team and discussed, okay, this is what the scope of it is from a legal perspective, legal and regulatory weighing in, saying it's these things, yes, we agree, we can solve them in a multitude of technological approaches. The legal interpretation gave us what they thought it was, what it wasn't. We had some business resources from project management perspective, so BAs, working with some of the data stewards to define what we believed the US CDI, CPCDS data sets were. And then ultimately, architecture was compiling a market view for how we would approach solving this problem. Do we reuse, buy, build? What can we extend within our architecture? What reusable pieces do we have? So together, we basically got the scope defined for our business partners and got everybody kind of in the same frame of mind. Research and selection was actually extremely heavy at this point. We had a stakeholder who maybe had less to do with interoperability than a clinical partner would, but they were very adamant that they were the owners of interoperability at the time. So because of that, they wanted to see a lot of due diligence that went into why we selected or would recommend a different approach other than a system that maybe they had control over. So in order to do that, the architecture team, myself as the lead, we looked at the technical capabilities for interoperability. That was from integration, data management, data transformation, identity and access management, these types of technical capabilities. And we did an assessment on how we currently enabled those today, the level of maturity and what technologies underlying were changing associated with that capability. We did the same thing on the business side to see where we were for provider information management, clinical information management, and things of that nature, and defining all those data needs during that technical assessment. We also did an external analysis. How are our market partners solving this? What's happening in the various different areas for business? So for Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, are other people having conversations on solving interoperability? We're a little federated in that perspective, so I always want to make sure I pull in some constituents from the market, as well as find out how the industry was solving it. Is it TriZetto? Is it HealthShare? Is it Innovacer? Who's going where, and what's the best possible approach for that? So what we did was compiled those representative vendors. We had a capability scorecard from a technical perspective and a business perspective, and we started having RFPs, RFIs, conversations with vendors, deciding who can meet our needs for what our goal was. We'd already established some lofty goals ahead of time associated with what interoperability can do for us. So now it was pick the system that can get us there, pick the team that best positions us for some of the future growth that we have. So from that point on, I'm talking to you because we selected InterSystems, and we made that decision, began contracting, getting our PMO engagement, some of the project resources necessary. A few of you in this room definitely worked with you during this process, and began implementation. So from a delivery perspective, I'd mentioned some of the intersection with some technology capabilities. What we did was said this is what InterSystem brings to bear with Iris and HealthShare and the products that came along from the interoperability FHIR perspective. We had to look at some of the different technologies that we were also investing in, our iPaaS and Okta, and things of that nature to make sure that these engines play well, or if we had to make a decision to opt for an enterprise tool that we were investing in over maybe something that was a component that InterSystems brought. These were things that we put through the EARB and the Solution Architecture Review Board to make sure that everybody was comfortable with which components we were picking and kind of the rationale behind that. We were also establishing integration patterns, some new authentication authorization patterns, because we were switching from authentication on our portals in more of a custom manner using SAML tokens as opposed to the OpenID and OAuth patterns that are typically required for this type of implementation for interoperability and smart on FHIR apps. Then came the big challenge, data information and requirements. So we knew, and it's funny, there was an earlier presentation today from HealthX where they talked about supplementing the semantic or some syntactic layer for data that went into the USCDI data set. USCDI was V1 at the time we were implementing this for interoperability, and I really wouldn't call it a standard. I mean, it was saying use these LOINC codes or SNOMED codes, but it was kind of just directional. it was assessments, it was care plan, and we would have to look back at our own internal data and say, I think this is part of that set, so let's include it. So the challenge was taking the US CDI and CAR and Blue Button CPCDS data requirements and then looking at 388 different systems of record that either had a master copy of some set of this data or a replica copy of this data. So we had to go through the process of saying it's these sets of domains that would have clinical information or claims payment or provider information that we would source that data from. That started the process of doing our data mappings, so understanding that those systems published out copies of provider claims or clinical information to downstream systems or other interfaces to consume them and expose them. We had to determine which representation we were going to use to hydrate HealthShare for the 5 years data set. And over time, right, trying to find the right data stewards and all the people that would be responsible for saying, yeah, I'll throw my hat into that ring, I own that data, this is the piece that we should use, was its own challenge. I'm sure Sean remembers quite a few conversations like that, where we were taking the representation in multiple forms and just deciding, okay, this meets this SDA representation, and we understand the requirements for FHIR projection. A lot of data mapping and having to get clinical folks, talk to technical folks, and business owners. While we were doing that, we were also putting together our approach for North Star for interoperability in general. That was data acquisition, storage, enrichment, and then ultimately analytics and enablement. So actually getting the information to our customers or our internal users that would use it for some sort of business analysis. This picture is a little bit of a mess, but we worked with a couple partners internal within architecture and some consulting groups to say that this was our general approach for data acquisition, ingestion, understanding, and then publication. Solution design and delivery. So by this time, we are setting up HealthShare. We have identified our data sets, and we are getting ready to hydrate it. So this is making sure that we have the right data publication patterns to get the information into HealthShare. We had to learn a little bit on the fly, so to speak, for some of these things, since we had data in multiple representations, and we were coming up with new patterns that we had never seen before, specifically sharing our data with a third-party app that we didn't have any prior relationship with. Obviously, information security, third-party risk had their own concerns that they wanted to make sure were addressed. Architecture, myself, put together several documents like this with the numbers and letters corresponding to epics or large use cases that would have a defined input-output set, and be able to hand that off to solution architects with saying, this particular use case or epic includes this data set and should give this functionality. And accompanying was new patterns, UML diagrams, things to further describe the interfaces or how data would flow ultimately to HealthShare or to the FHIR endpoint that would be consumed. A lot of this was reviewed from the solutions perspective, the EARB, and then made its way into the developer's hands that would support ultimately the project moving forward. Challenges, of which there were many. So I've mentioned it a few times. When we went into this, we knew ahead of time that there were going to be technology roadmap collisions. We were bringing up new systems, we were going into new markets, delivering new products, all while trying to make sure that we met the ONC final rule, had the data sets, and understood them. Some of the solution that we used for this was basically documenting and cataloging technical debt along the way. If we said we weren't going to use a component or we were going to leave something on the cutting room floor for a moment, we made sure that it made its way into that development team's or that functional area's backlog so they could at least address it at some point in time. That was the best way we could handle making fast decisions for a fast approaching date, which kind of was a little fuzzy, but we'll get into that later. Historical data representation challenges. So For the 5 years of clinical US CDI data, we were good for a portion of it, right? We had our current care management, utilization management system that had prior authorization data, patient care team information, care management notes and progress, goals, et cetera. But we had actually just swapped that out about 2.5 years prior from another system. So the rest of the 3 years of data that we needed was in various forms that ultimately made its way into our new CMUM system. But there were problems taking those mappings and actually making sure that they fit the transactional flow of data. So we needed to make sure not only were we getting the day-to-day flow of people updating clinical information, but also we had all that historical 5 years worth of data. That was the biggest challenge, was getting groups together to understand why did assessments look drastically different in 2018 than they did in 2019. And stitching together some of that information to make sure that we had a full picture. For that, it was basically provenance, talking to different groups that had responsibility for different pieces of information over time to make sure that we could get it into at least a canonical or something that we agreed upon from a representation perspective. Missing codes and terminology for data sets. Again, that HealthHIX group or presentation was spot on when it came to this. We had data from HIEs, provider organizations, FQHCs, different groups that their data had a tremendous amount of holes in it, where you would have to review it and understand what it actually meant. And maybe not, those people weren't here, there was no map, any of the data documentation was lacking, especially for some of that 5-year period. So this was kind of a SWAT group of individuals, very similar to what HealthHIX did, where we had a clinician, myself as the enterprise architect, a data specialist or analyst, and then somebody from the business side that may be the closest thing to a steward. Architecture myself, I put together principles or rule sets for how we were going to fill in the missing code pieces or try to stitch together the data. This came to principles of, if you can't solve it and you can't get past it today, move it to the bottom of the list, keep moving through the data to try and get some level of ownership. This came to the point where I had to make some executive decisions when we couldn't find a steward or owner within the business, and we need to hydrate that information, where we would document it and send it back out to the business and say, give us feedback. This was our interpretation. This was a clinical interpretation. Legal agrees. Let's all make sure that we can agree or at least come back and change that. The keynote this morning of indecision is worse than a bad decision really truly hits home. Waffling or not making that key decision at that time several times during this implementation put us behind the 8 ball, where it was better for me to say, this is it, I'm going to document it, we'll move forward. Incomplete data sets, very much the same thing, where we would get immunization data. It could have been for like MMR or something to that effect. And for some reason, state immunization registries would just be massively incomplete. We would lose something in translation. The historical information that we had when we tried to get it back from places like, or states like Kentucky or markets that have a lot more rural hospitals, there was just a lot of volatility and a lot of bad data that we had to mow through that just caused that team to have to work more and more to get it in a usable fashion. And then misinterpretation of data sets required. So this goes to the fact that 837D claims were included for interoperability, but when it came down to actually implementing that for the implementation guide, there were missing pieces to it, and CMS at the last minute basically said, you don't have to include these in the patient data set for our CPCDS. So we were running things down to the last minute, and we had a lot of good partners at InterSystems, Linda Rowe navigating CMS and some of the other regulators with us in order to get us answers on questions that we had about understanding or interpretation from a legal perspective to a clinical perspective to an implementation perspective. Near misses. We had quite a few. Over that 5-year time span, we had a lot of supplemental partners or supplemental health benefit partners, delegates, and this goes to data consistency again. So if we switched pharmacy benefits managers in 2018, so some of the NCPDP data we had from CVS, the formularies, the actual claims and drugs files, massively different than what we got from ESI. We had the dental health issues, and then some of the unknown unknowns. I had been at CareSource for 10 years, but if I didn't know that we used this niche vendor that somebody in the provider side knew that added or enhanced our provider data, and I was unaware of it, and they never came forward to tell us, it was a near miss that we had to get that same SWAT team together and get it into HealthShare. We addressed a lot of these by creating defensive policies for the business. I myself drafted at least 5 or 10 different policies that came to while we were bringing up new technology, bringing in new data or new lines of business, that we would say, in order to honor the ONC final rule, our internal SLA would be something like 120 days from notice of the new data set to published into our FHIR endpoints. Several types of policies like that basically protected the business or gave us some length of time that CMS wasn't explicit about meeting, other than the 30 days for provider and 24 hours for claims, that we would move that information and make it available to patients or the public at large. So lots of defensive policies that were put together in order to handle any near misses or something that maybe we wouldn't see coming. We had to write vaguely specific, I guess is how I would put some of these policies. They covered large swaths, and ultimately legal signed off on them. So let's talk about the future for interoperability and where we're going. CareSource has plans in the near term to move to the next release here in the fall for InterSystems and IRIS. We're going to implement more of the member match functionality for the payer-to-payer data exchange. Right now, our payer-to-payer data exchange is really, there's a patient interaction in the middle there where they would log on from Payer 1's website and say, send my information into Payer 2. They have to authenticate themselves. It's basically the same smart on FHIR app authentication mechanism that was required for the 1-1 ruling. We'd like to get into the mode where, as CareSource as the payer, we could get that list of information from a state constituency or an enrollment, and there would be a button that basically said, please get my information from my previous payer. Here's their information, and we can go out and connect, say it's Eric Tienda, birth date, sex information, find the match, retrieve his information, and then we can use that analysis to understand Eric as a new patient. And it's less of having to have campaigns to reach out to Eric, asking him to give us consent to get his information. It's more, it's patient-driven, but it's upfront, and it's a little bit more behind the scenes for us as a payer. So that includes moving all of our payer data exchange right to the PDEX implementation guide, and exposing a patient match service for identity resolution. This could be for other programs. So when we bring in a new patient into HealthShare, we go through the patient identity management and register them in HealthShare, but we have programs that are not tied to benefit or medical coverage as a government plan. This includes things like prisoner release programs or social determinant programs where these individuals don't actually have a registered benefit or coverage plan from us, but we still want to control and have an identity that we manage for them for the portal or sharing other information to social determinant partners. We haven't put these individuals through our patient identity management service. It's on our roadmap. And then solidify some of our internal processes for onboarding new third-party apps or individuals that want to connect to our services. We were pretty shoestring with how we put this together initially to get us over the finish line, and some of the internal processes are just manual and heavy for information security, third-party risk, and then ultimately our interoperability team to take some of those requests and build them, test and work with them, and make sure that they get through any of the bugs that they might encounter. Long-term, from a long-term perspective, CareSource is aligned with a lot of the things that we talked about today from a product perspective, or yesterday, from a product perspective for HealthShare and InterSystems. We want to be able to connect to more EMRs. Our business is constantly telling us that they need connectivity to Epic or Cerner or more data, right? We need to be able to implement some processes to make that happen and get a good repeatable pattern for connecting to EMRs. That also goes in line with some of the PAS and prior authorization implementations that we have seen and discussed here this week. Aligning HealthShare to internal interfaces. We expose patient information to third-party apps that patients can look at their leisure or whatever way that that app represents that data. But we have different enterprise APIs that we use for surfacing that today. Our provider and member portal are assembling information that is different than what we would publish on a FHIR API. We're not actually eating our own dog food, so to speak. So that's a big goal, is that we start aligning our internal interfaces, our mobile app, our member portal, and any of our CRM tools that might be visible from an internal employee perspective, start aligning the data that we're publishing out so everybody's reading from the same hymnal, so to speak. And then obviously, alerts and analytics as we get in ADTs and some of the more real-time notification services that we can push to our constituents so that they know what's happening with a patient when something happens near real time. Another long-term plan for us is granular consent when it comes to access to clinical information. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, working on some of the consent frameworks for exchanging patient information as a payer, so from payer to payer or from payer to provider, or other HIEs. Payers recognize different or data consents in a different way than an EMR would, and right now we're very much opt-in, opt-out as a payer, and we put that into the hands of patients, but it's not as granular as we'd like to be. That was by design initially, but we also didn't have a good framework that was mature enough to tie ourselves to. So looking at the FHIR consent framework and how we can start pointing everything to controlling it as FHIR resources or data sets and putting that in the hands of our patients, allowing them to be in control of what you see and what you don't see, or what we share and don't share to deliver healthcare to them. In summation, basically educate your business partners and normalize the meaning of interoperability. This effort was a challenge internally because interoperability doesn't hit the ear right for a lot of our business constituents. It sounds like you're saying encapsulation or canonical to them, and they just shut down and they think it's something you're just doing from a technical perspective, when in reality it's enabling clinical data for healthcare delivery. When you tell a story and leave out the word interoperability, which I've had to train myself to do, and literally talk about all the things, the cool things we can do with clinical data in delivering care to our patients and members, I've gotten way further than I have whenever I mention interoperability. Plan and roadmap. We can't get everything done immediately. We have grandiose plans, but some things won't get picked up. I may want to do something with consent that nobody feels like funding or doing anything with. I'm going to keep it on the roadmap year after year. I'm going to make sure that some constituents that don't have as much money, or stakeholders that don't have as big of a budget as maybe operations does, that they get visibility into the important things that they need and can get done with interoperability and clinical data sharing. Also, continually review and point back to your North Star. You created it early on in the project, more than likely. You have a goal of where you want to go in 2 to 3 years. Are you meeting that? What's changing with it from a technology perspective as well as a business perspective? And then document. I can't stress documenting enough. It's policies, it's knowledge articles, it's making sure that everything that everybody touched while you were delivering it is memorialized somewhere. We can go back to it. Eric, why did you make that decision to pick that particular LOINC code for that immunization. Well, it says here that nobody would stand up and we had to move forward. I got consensus, documented it here, and here we are today. And that's it. That's my presentation. I appreciate everybody's time. Thank you.